The room was cold. Not from the winter wind that howled outside the reinforced concrete walls of the Wolfschanze, but from something deeper, a chill that seeped through the hearts of men who had once believed themselves invincible. It was July 1944, and the air inside the Führer's bunker carried the weight of 1,000 battlefield defeats, each one a crack in the foundation of an empire built on fear and iron will. The walls were grey. The maps spread across the heavy oak table were marked with red lines that retreated like bleeding wounds across Europe. And in the center of it all stood Adolf Hitler, his left hand trembling slightly, his eyes burning with a fury that could no longer hide the terror beneath. The generals stood in a semicircle around him, some with their arms folded, others with their hands behind their backs, shoulders tight with unspoken defiance. They had come here as soldiers, trained to obey without question, conditioned to see their Führer as the architect of destiny. But the war had changed them. The Eastern Front had changed them. The bodies piled in the snow outside Stalingrad, the tanks burning in the mud of Kursk, the relentless advance of Soviet armies that no longer feared the Wehrmacht. All of it had transformed these men from believers into witnesses of a slow, agonizing collapse. And now, inside this room, deep in the forests of East Prussia, they would watch as the man who had promised them the world began to lose his grip on reality itself. Hitler's voice cut through the silence like a blade scraping stone. He spoke of treachery. He spoke of cowardice. He accused his own generals of sabotage, of deliberately undermining his orders, of refusing to fight with the fanaticism required to reverse the tide. His words came in bursts, sharp and venomous, punctuated by the slam of his fist against the table. The maps jumped. A glass of water toppled, spilling across the battle lines of Army Group Center, already encircled and dying in Belarus. No one moved to right it. The water spread slowly, blurring the symbols of divisions that no longer existed. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel stood closest to Hitler, his face pale and expressionless. He had long ago surrendered his will to the Führer's vision, earning him the nickname Lacatel among his peers, the lackey. He nodded at every accusation, murmured agreement at every demand, his loyalty no longer a matter of conviction, but of survival. Beside him, Colonel General Alfred Jodl stared at the maps with the hollow eyes of a man who had calculated the mathematics of defeat and found no equation that led to victory. He had stopped arguing weeks ago. What was the point? The Führer did not accept reality. He rewrote it with rage and delusion, ordering phantom divisions into battle, commanding armies that existed only on paper to execute maneuvers that defied both logic and physics. But there were others in the room who had not yet surrendered their minds. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, stood with his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if steadying himself against a violent wind. He had watched his beloved panzer divisions ground down to scrap metal on the steppes of Russia, had seen brilliant tactical victories squandered by orders to hold untenable positions, to never retreat, to die in place rather than live to fight another day. He knew what needed to be said. He knew what every honest military mind in that room understood, but dared not speak. The war was lost. Not tomorrow, not next month. It was already lost. The only question now was how many more would die before the inevitable end. Hitler turned his fury on Guderian. The general had suggested, carefully, diplomatically, that Army Group North should withdraw from the Baltic states to shorten the defensive line and preserve forces for the coming battles in the Reich itself. The Führer's response was volcanic. He shouted that retreat was treason, that every inch of conquered territory must be held at any cost, that the will of the German soldier was stronger than Soviet steel. His face flushed red. Spittle flew from his lips. His right hand shot out, pointing at Guderian like a prosecutor condemning a criminal. The general did not flinch. He had faced Soviet T-34s at point-blank range. He had commanded men through the frozen hell of the Russian winter. He would not be cowed by a tantrum. The tension in the room became unbearable. Other generals shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Hitler and Guderian, measuring the danger, calculating their own positions. Some of them, had been part of the conspiracy that had nearly killed Hitler just weeks earlier. The bomb planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg that had torn through the conference room at the Wolfschanze, killing 4 men but leaving the Führer miraculously alive. The purge that followed had been swift and merciless. Hundreds executed. Thousands arrested. The conspirators hanged with piano wire, their deaths filmed for Hitler to watch in his private theater. The message was clear. Dissent meant death. And yet, even now, even after the terror, the doubt remained. It festered in the silence between Hitler's tirades, in the glances exchanged when his back was turned, in the quiet calculations of men who knew that loyalty to the Führer had become indistinguishable from complicity in a collective suicide. Outside the bunker, the war continued its relentless advance toward Germany. In the east, the Soviet steamroller ground forward, liberating city after city, leaving behind a trail of vengeance for the horrors inflicted during the German invasion. In the west, American and British forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France, closing the distance to the Rhine. In the south, Italy had collapsed, Mussolini overthrown and rescued only by a desperate German commando raid. The Axis was crumbling. The 1,000-year Reich that Hitler had promised was now measured in months, perhaps weeks. And yet, inside this room, the Führer demanded miracles. He spoke of secret weapons that would turn the tide. The V-2 rockets raining down on London. The jet fighters that would sweep Allied bombers from the sky. The wonder tanks and super soldiers that existed only in the fevered imaginations of propaganda ministers and desperate engineers. General Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's chief adjutant, stood near the door, his hand resting on the holster of his pistol. Not as a threat, but as a reminder. The room was watched. The walls had ears. Every word spoken here would be reported, analyzed, judged for signs of defeatism or disloyalty. The Gestapo was everywhere now, even in the highest circles of military command. Trust had become a luxury no one could afford. And so the generals played their parts, nodding when expected, murmuring agreement when required, while inside their minds they wrestled with the terrible knowledge that they were presiding over a catastrophe of their own making. Hitler began to pace. His steps were uneven, his left leg dragging slightly, a consequence of the assassination attempt, or perhaps just the accumulation of years spent bent over maps, driving his body and mind to the edge of collapse. He spoke of history, of Frederick the Great surrounded by enemies, saved at the last moment by a miracle. He spoke of willpower as the ultimate weapon, of the German spirit as unconquerable. His voice rose and fell in waves, hypnotic and manic, as if he could reshape reality through the force of his conviction. Some of the generals still listened with a flicker of hope clinging to the belief that perhaps somehow the man who had led them from the ashes of Versailles to the gates of Moscow still possessed some hidden insight, some final masterstroke that would redeem everything. But Guderian saw through it. So did Field Marshal Walter Model, the defensive genius who had stabilized the Eastern Front after the disaster at Kursk, buying time with tactical brilliance and the blood of his men. Model stood in the shadows, his face carved from granite, his eyes cold and calculating. He had argued with Hitler before, and survived, barely. He knew the cost of honesty, but he also knew the cost of silence. Every day that passed without a strategic withdrawal, every order to hold hopeless positions, every refusal to face the reality of Germany's situation, meant thousands more dead. Young men thrown into the meat grinder of a war that could no longer be won, sacrificed not for victory, but for the delusions of one man. The argument escalated. Hitler demanded that Army Group Center, already encircled by Soviet forces in Belarus, launch a counterattack to break out and retake lost ground. Guderian pointed at the map, his voice steady and firm. There was no Army Group Center anymore. It had been annihilated. 28 divisions destroyed in the Soviet summer offensive. Over 300,000 men killed, captured, or missing. The units that Hitler was ordering into battle existed only in his imagination. The general's words hung in the air like a death sentence. For a moment, the room was utterly silent. Even the distant rumble of artillery seemed to pause, as if the war itself was holding its breath. Hitler's face twisted. His eyes bulged. His hand shot to his forehead, pressing against his temple as if trying to contain a pain that no morphine could touch. He screamed that Guderian was a traitor, that all of them were traitors, that the only reason Germany was losing was because his generals lacked the courage to follow his orders. The words echoed off the concrete walls, filling the room with a madness that was no longer possible to ignore. This was not strategy. This was not leadership. This was the unraveling of a mind that had consumed itself in the fires of its own ambition. And yet, the generals did not walk out. They did not arrest him. They did not put a bullet in his head and end the nightmare. Some because they still feared him. Some because they feared the chaos that would follow. Some because they had tied their own fates so completely to his that they could no longer imagine a world without him. And some because, deep in the darkest corners of their souls, they still believed, or wanted to believe, that somehow, against all reason, a miracle might still come. But miracles do not come to men who build their empires on the bones of the innocent. They do not come to those who wage wars of annihilation, who burn cities and starve nations, who turn industrial efficiency toward the machinery of genocide. The gods of war are indifferent, but the gods of justice are not. And in that room, in that moment, the generals of the Third Reich stood face to face with a truth they could no longer deny. They had followed a madman into the abyss, and now the abyss was swallowing them whole. The meeting dragged on for hours. Maps were redrawn. Orders were issued that would never be carried out. Divisions that no longer existed were assigned to offensives that would never happen. Hitler's voice grew hoarse. His trembling worsened. But he would not stop. He could not stop. To stop would be to admit defeat, and defeat was a concept his mind could no longer process. He had become a prisoner of his own mythology, trapped inside the narrative he had created, unable to see beyond the walls of his own delusion. When the meeting finally ended, the generals filed out in silence. Some saluted. Some simply turned and walked away. In the corridor outside, they did not speak to each other. They did not exchange knowing glances or whispered complaints. They returned to their posts, to their command bunkers and field headquarters, to the dying armies they were expected to lead with tactics and strategies that made no sense. And they obeyed. Not because they believed, not because they hoped, but because the alternative, rebellion, surrender, the complete dissolution of everything they had built their lives around, was unthinkable. In the days and weeks that followed, the war continued its inexorable march toward Berlin. The Soviet armies smashed through the remnants of Army Group Center and drove deep into Poland. The Western Allies liberated Paris and pushed toward the German border. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, was reduced to a handful of obsolete fighters and untrained pilots throwing themselves against armadas of American bombers. The U-boats that had once brought Britain to the edge of starvation were hunted down and sunk in growing numbers. The oil fields of Romania, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht's mechanized forces, fell to the Red Army. And inside the Wolfschanze, inside the increasingly claustrophobic world of Hitler's inner circle, reality continued to be denied, rewritten, and ignored. Guderian would clash with Hitler again and again in the months to come, each confrontation more bitter than the last, until finally, in March 1945, with Soviet tanks on the outskirts of Berlin, he would be relieved of command and sent into forced retirement. Model would fight on, conducting brilliant defensive battles in the Ruhr pocket, before finally, surrounded and hopeless, putting a bullet in his own head, rather than face capture and trial. Keitel and Jodl would remain loyal to the end, signing surrender documents in May 1945 before being hanged as war criminals at Nuremberg. But it all began here, in this room, on this day when the Führer lost control. Not of his armies. For those had already slipped through his fingers like sand, but of the one thing that had sustained him from the beginning. The absolute unquestioning belief of his generals that he was more than a man, that he was destiny incarnate. That belief died in the silence between his tirades in the eyes of men who had finally seen too much lost too much, been asked to sacrifice too much for a vision that had revealed itself to be nothing more than the fever dream of a failed artist turned mass murderer. The war would continue for 10 more months. Millions more would die. Cities would be reduced to rubble. A continent would be scarred beyond recognition. But the true end of the Third Reich did not come with the fall of Berlin, or the suicide in the bunker, or the unconditional surrender signed in Reims and repeated in Berlin. It came here, in this moment, when the last vestiges of faith drained from the hearts of the men who had carried Hitler's orders to the four corners of Europe. They had believed in victory, then they had believed in survival. And now, standing in that cold room, with the maps of retreat spread before them, and the sound of distant artillery growing ever closer, they believed in nothing at all. The war was lost. And somewhere, beneath the layers of denial and rage and desperate hope, Adolf Hitler knew it too. But he would never admit it. He would never accept it. He would drag Germany down with him into the ruins, demanding that an entire nation immolate itself on the altar of his ego. And his generals, the professional soldiers who had sworn oaths and worn uniforms and prided themselves on discipline and honor, would continue to obey. Not because they were monsters, though some of them were. Not because they were fanatics, though some of them were that too. But because they had crossed a line so long ago that they could no longer remember what it felt like to stand on the other side. They had become complicit in something so vast, so terrible, that the only path forward was deeper into the darkness. The door to the conference room closed. The sound echoed through the bunker like the ceiling of a tomb. Outside, the war raged on. Inside, in the silence that followed the storm of Hitler's fury, the generals returned to their quarters to sleep or smoke or stare at walls and wonder how it had come to this. How men of intelligence and training and experience had allowed themselves to be led by a man who was clearly, undeniably mad. How they had convinced themselves that loyalty was more important than reason, that obedience was more virtuous than conscience, that the survival of the regime was worth any price. But those questions had no answers. Or rather, they had too many answers, each one more damning than the last. And so they did not ask them. They buried them beneath reports and orders and the endless demands of a war that consumed everything and gave back nothing. They told themselves they were doing their duty. They told themselves they had no choice. They told themselves that history would judge them not by the cause they served, but by the professionalism with which they served it. History would judge them. But not the way they hoped. The Wolfschanze would be abandoned in the winter of 1944 as Soviet armies closed in. The bunkers would be demolished by retreating German engineers, blown apart with explosives in a futile attempt to deny the enemy any propaganda value. But the ruins would remain, half buried in the Polish forests, a monument to the folly of absolute power and the men who enabled it. Tourists would walk through the shattered concrete in the decades to come, marveling at the thickness of the walls and the complexity of the defenses, and they would wonder how anyone could have believed that hiding in a bunker could save them from the consequences of their choices. The generals did not hide. They fought on until the end, some with courage, some with desperation, all with the growing certainty that they were already ghosts, men whose deaths had simply not yet caught up with their bodies. And when the end finally came, when the guns fell silent and the flags were lowered and the trials began, they would stand before the world and offer their defenses. They were soldiers. They followed orders. They did their duty. But the world was no longer listening. The world had seen the camps. The world had counted the dead. The world had looked into the heart of the Third Reich and found there not glory or genius, but something infinitely small and infinitely dark. Inside the room where Hitler lost control of his generals, that darkness was born. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of silences, the slow erosion of conscience, the thousand small surrenders that led to the great collapse. It was born in the choice to obey rather than rebel, to enable rather than resist, to preserve one's career and life at the cost of one's soul. And when the generals walked out of that room and returned to their commands, they carried that darkness with them, spreading it across the battlefields of a dying empire, ensuring that even in defeat, The cost would be measured in the millions. The cold remained. It seeped through the concrete and steel, through the layers of maps and reports, through the hearts of men who had once believed themselves invincible. And it would remain long after the war ended, a chill that could not be dispelled by victory or time or the comfortable distance of history. Because some wounds do not heal, some choices cannot be undone, and some rooms, once entered, can never truly be left behind. The war was lost. The generals knew it, and in knowing it, they had lost something far more precious than battles or territory, or even their lives. They had lost the ability to look at themselves and see anything but the reflection of the man they had followed into madness. In the end, that was Hitler's final victory, not over his enemies, but over the men who had served him most faithfully. He had made them into mirrors of himself, and now, no matter how far they ran, or how loudly they protested their innocence, they would carry his image with them forever. The echo of his voice lingered in that room long after he left. It lingered in the corridors of power, in the field headquarters scattered across a continent, in the minds of soldiers who would wake screaming for decades to come. And it lingers still, a reminder that the greatest dangers are not always the ones we see coming, but the ones we invite in ourselves, the compromises we make, the truths we ignore, the orders we follow, because it is easier than standing alone. In that room, on that day, history turned. Not with the drama of a battle or the finality of a surrender, but with something quieter and more terrible. The recognition that madness had triumphed over reason, and that those who should have stopped it had instead chosen to serve it. The generals walked out into a world that was already ending, but they did not yet know it. They still believed they had time. They still believed they could salvage something from the wreckage. They were wrong. The only thing left to salvage was their souls, and most of them had already sold those years ago.